When a man saves a drowning chimpanzee, he inadvertently starts a cross-species friendship. As the ape recovers from the ordeal, he shows his gratitude in an almost unimaginable way. At the Detroit Zoo, families laughed and pointed at the various animals. Suddenly, a loud splash interrupted the cheer. JoJo, an 18-year-old chimpanzee, had slipped into the enclosure's murky water. He thrashed wildly. The safety cable meant to protect him had failed. Visitors gasped and watched helplessly as JoJo struggled to stay afloat. His dark eyes were wide with terror. Parents pulled their children closer, and cameras that had been snapping photos of the chimps were now focused on the struggling JoJo. Zoo workers were alerted by the commotion and rushed to the scene. One worker grabbed a long pole and tried to reach the floundering chimp, while another called for backup on the radio. Their efforts seemed futile as JoJo's thrashing grew more frantic. Panic swept through the crowd. The zoo staff's desperate attempts to help only made it clear that something more drastic needed to be done. Among the crowd, a man stood frozen. His heart pounded as he saw the chimp's life slipping away. The seconds ticked by in agonizing slowness. The enclosure, designed to mimic the chimp's natural habitat, had a water feature to provide a cooling spot. However, the water posed a risk, as chimps are not natural swimmers. A safety cable had been installed to prevent accidents, holding everything together, but unfortunately, this was not enough to stop JoJo from slipping. Now the disaster was unfolding in front of everyone's eyes. JoJo, the 18-year-old chimpanzee, had been a resident of the Detroit Zoo since he was a young orphan. His playful antics and engaging personality endeared him to everyone who met him. But on this day his demeanor changed in an instant as he tumbled from the high platform. A collective gasp echoed from the crowd. JoJo's desperate cries filled the air as he struggled in the water, his movements becoming increasingly frantic. Zookeepers rushed to the edge of the enclosure, but it was a visitor who acted first. Rick Swope, a sturdy truck driver from Detroit, was at the zoo with his wife and 3 children on his rare day off. The commotion at the chimpanzee enclosure caught their attention, and Rick's heart sank as they approached. He saw JoJo, the 135-pound chimp, struggling in the water. Rick felt a surge of urgency. He couldn't just stand by and watch the chimp drown. Without a second thought, Rick's mind raced through the possibilities. He knew the danger-involved chimps were incredibly strong, and the enclosure was off limits to visitors for a reason. Yet he couldn't ignore the helpless creature's plight. His wife grabbed his arm, sensing his intent. "Rick, what are you doing?" she asked. Rick glanced at his family, then back at JoJo. The decision was instant. "I have to help him," he said, shaking off his wife's grip. He pushed through the crowd. The zoo workers were trying their best, but it wasn't enough. Rick knew this was a matter of seconds. Rick reached the edge of the forbidden ape enclosure and then jumped. The moment his feet hit the ground, he understood the recklessness of his decision. The enclosure was designed to mimic the chimp's natural habitat. It was filled with rocks, trees, and dense underbrush. But it was the water that disturbed him. It was murky and dark, a fast-flowing, swirling mess of mud and debris. JoJo's thrashing had churned up the bottom and made it nearly impossible to see through the opaque surface. Rick plunged into the water without hesitation. The cold shock hit him like a wall. He struggled to keep his balance. The slippery rocks beneath his feet made every step treacherous. JoJo was just a few feet away, but the distance felt like miles. The chimp's eyes were wide with terror, his powerful limbs flailing in a desperate attempt to stay afloat. Rick reached out and managed to grab hold of JoJo's arm. The chimp's strength was astonishing. His muscles tensed and pulled with a force that nearly knocked Rick off his feet. For a moment it seemed as though JoJo might drag him under, but Rick held on. The other chimps sensed the commotion and gathered at the edge of the water. Some of them bared their teeth, a warning that they could turn aggressive at any moment. Rick had to work quickly. The longer he stayed, the greater the risk. He tried to pull JoJo towards the shore, but the slippery rocks made it hard to gain any traction. His muscles strained with the effort, and the cold water sapped his strength. For a terrifying moment, JoJo slipped from his grasp and disappeared beneath the surface. Rick's heart stopped as he frantically searched the water, his hands groping blindly through the muck. Finally, he felt the coarse fur of JoJo's arm and pulled with all his might. The chimp broke the surface and gasped for air. Rick could vaguely hear the crowd's cheers. He managed to drag JoJo closer to the shore, but the final stretch was the hardest. The water grew shallower, but the rocks became even more slippery. Rick's feet slipped and slid. Every step was a struggle. As they neared the edge, one of the other chimps suddenly charged. It was a blur of movement and noise. Rick's instincts kicked in. He raised an arm to protect himself. The chimp stopped short. The aggressive display was meant to intimidate rather than attack. Rick took the opportunity to heave JoJo onto the rocky shore. The chimpanzee lay panting, and Rick collapsed beside him, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The enormity of what he had just done was starting to sink in. Then the other chimps began to grow restless. Their calls turned from curious to agitated. A chorus of sharp cries and hoots echoed through the enclosure. Rick sensed the shift in the atmosphere. He looked up and saw one of the larger male chimps advancing toward them. The primate's eyes were locked on Rick, his posture aggressive and territorial. The crowd above seemed to hold their breath. Everybody sensed the imminent danger. The chimpanzee's powerful arm swung as he moved. Rick could see the muscles rippling under his fur. Chimps were known to be 5 times stronger than humans, and this male looked every bit as formidable as that reputation suggested. Rick's heart raced. The large male chimp let out a loud, aggressive bark and bared his teeth in a threatening display. Rick instinctively put himself between JoJo and the advancing chimp. He raised his arms in a feeble attempt to appear larger and more intimidating. The gesture was a gamble. He hoped it would be enough to make the male hesitate. For a brief moment, the two faced off. Rick could feel his muscles trembling, both from exertion and fear. The chimp stopped a few feet away, his eyes darting between Rick and JoJo. It was a standoff that could turn violent at any second. The zoo workers were now acutely aware of the new danger. One of them grabbed a tranquilizer gun, but Rick knew it might take precious seconds for the sedative to take effect, seconds they might not have. Suddenly the big male lunged forward, his powerful limbs propelling him toward Rick and JoJo. Rick's adrenaline spiked. He braced himself for the impact. But just as the chimp was about to reach them, a smaller female intervened. She darted between the big male and Rick. The male paused. The female stood her ground. For a moment it seemed to work. The big male's posture relaxed slightly, and his aggressive stance softened. The zoo worker with the tranquilizer gun took aim. Rick could only hope they wouldn't need to use it. The male sensed the shift in attention and backed off slightly, but still watched Rick with wary eyes. The moment of aggression had passed, but the tension lingered. Rick finally reached the zoo staff, who had come into the enclosure after him, and helped them lift JoJo onto a stretcher. The immediate danger had passed, but the experience had left him shaken. Just as JoJo was being secured onto the stretcher by the zoo staff, a loud, ominous snap echoed through the enclosure. Rick's heart dropped as he recognized the sound. The safety cable had failed. The cable was already compromised from JoJo's initial fall. Now it had given way completely under the strain of the recent chaos. It dangled uselessly, its support was gone, and so the enclosure's precarious balance was thrown into disarray. "Move back," one of the zoo workers shouted. She tried to usher the onlookers away from the potential collapse zone. Rick positioned himself between JoJo and the impending danger. He knew they had to act quickly to avoid another catastrophe. The leaning tree created a ripple effect within the enclosure. The ground shifted and sent loose rocks tumbling towards the water. The other chimps, already agitated by the big male's aggression, now moved erratically as the tree continued to tilt. Rick saw that it was only a matter of moments before it came crashing down right on top of them. "Let's get him out of here," now Rick shouted to the zoo staff. Just then, a loud creak signaled the tree was coming down. Rick grabbed JoJo's stretcher and helped the zoo workers lift it as quickly as they could. The ground beneath them trembled. With a final heave, they managed to get JoJo to a safer spot. Then the tree gave way. It crashed into the water with a thunderous splash and sent waves and debris flying in all directions. Onlookers screamed and scrambled back. Rick stood in the midst of it all, drenched and exhausted. He looked around. JoJo and the zoo staff were safe. However, the danger was far from over. The structural integrity of the enclosure was compromised. There was no telling what might happen next. "Let's go quickly," Rick urged. The zoo workers nodded. Together, they carefully maneuvered JoJo toward the exit. Each step felt like walking on a tightrope. As they made their way out, the fallen tree lay half submerged in the water. The other chimps had retreated to the far end of the enclosure. Rick turned his focus back to JoJo. His breathing was still labored but steady. The journey out of the enclosure felt like an eternity. Just as they reached the safer part of the enclosure, JoJo's panic took over. Despite being on the stretcher, the chimp's survival instincts kicked in. He began to thrash violently. His powerful limbs flailed, and his eyes were wide with fear. "Hold him down," one of the zoo workers shouted, but it was easier said than done. JoJo's strength was astonishing. He managed to knock one of the workers off balance. Rick felt JoJo's grip tighten around his arm. The chimp's resistance made it nearly impossible to secure him safely. The stretcher rocked precariously as JoJo's movements became more frantic. Rick's heart pounded as he realized they were in danger of losing control of the situation. If JoJo managed to get off the stretcher, he could hurt himself or the people trying to save him. The chimp's fear-driven strength was a formidable challenge. "Get the tranquilizer ready," another worker instructed. He recognized that JoJo's panic was too much to handle without sedation, but time was running out. JoJo's thrashing grew more intense, and then the stretcher began to tip dangerously. The zoo worker with the tranquilizer dart finally moved in. "Hold him steady," he shouted. Rick braced himself and tightened his grip on JoJo, praying that the sedative would work quickly. With a swift motion, the dart was deployed. The effect wasn't immediate, but gradually the chimp's thrashing began to subside. His movement slowed, and the wild fear in his eyes started to fade. As they approached the water's edge to exit the enclosure, Rick felt a sudden sharp pain in his foot. He stumbled slightly. A jagged piece of metal was partially buried in the mud. The fall of the artificial tree had disturbed hidden debris and turned the area into a treacherous minefield. "Watch out. There's debris everywhere," Rick called out. His foot throbbed with pain. The zoo workers glanced nervously at the ground. The collapse of the tree had not only scattered debris, but also stirred up an unexpected current in the usually stagnant water. Rick noticed the water's flow changing. It created a hidden undertow that could easily sweep them off their feet if they weren't careful. As they waded through the shallow water, Rick felt the current tugging at his legs. The water was already murky and filled with silt now. It was impossible to see where they were stepping. He tightened his grip on JoJo's stretcher and urged the others to move quickly but carefully. One of the zoo workers lost their footing and nearly toppled into the water. The stretcher wobbled precariously. Rick's muscles strained with the effort to keep it steady. The hidden dangers of the enclosure, from the sharp metal to the unseen current, had made this rescue attempt much more difficult than they had anticipated. With a final push, they managed to cross the treacherous water and reach solid ground at the exit gate. Rick's foot ached and his legs trembled from the exertion. A team of veterinarians and additional zoo staff were ready and waiting. JoJo lay still. The sedative had sedated him, and the veterinarians worked swiftly to assess his condition. Rick could see the concern in their eyes. He's stable for now, but we need to get him to the clinic immediately, the lead veterinarian announced. The transport vehicle sped away, taking JoJo to the veterinary clinic where he would receive the care he needed. Rick watched it go, his mind replaying the harrowing events of the past hour. The zoo director approached Rick. "Mr. Swope, you've done something truly extraordinary today. We can't thank you enough," he said, extending his hand. Over the next few weeks, the story of Rick Swope's daring rescue of JoJo became a sensation. JoJo was recovering well at the zoo's veterinary clinic, thanks to the dedicated efforts of the zoo staff and the veterinarians. Rick started visiting, and oddly enough, he began bonding with JoJo. On one particularly bright morning, Rick received a call from the zoo director. "Rick, we'd like you to come to the clinic today." JoJo is doing much better, he said. An hour later, staff led Rick and his family to the clinic's recovery area. JoJo was in a large, comfortable enclosure designed to aid his recuperation. The sight of JoJo brought a smile to Rick's face. Seeing the chimp strong and lively again was the best reward he could have imagined. "JoJo has been very responsive to your visits," the lead vet said. "It seems he looks forward to them. Your presence has been a big part of his recovery." Rick approached the enclosure. JoJo immediately perked up. The chimp's eyes lit up, and he moved closer to the edge. Rick knelt down and reached out a hand to JoJo. The chimpanzee extended his own and gently touched Rick's fingertips. It was a moment of pure connection. But the real surprises were yet to come. As Rick and JoJo shared this quiet moment, JoJo did something remarkable. He reached out with his other hand and gently placed it on Rick's shoulder. Then the chimp pulled him into an embrace. Rick felt tears well up in his eyes. Rick's family and the zoo staff watched in awe. It was a moment that transcended words, a clear sign of the bond that had formed between man and chimp. The zoo director said, "Rick, this is truly extraordinary. We've never seen a chimp react this way. I bet JoJo knows you saved his life, and this is his way of showing his appreciation." In the days following JoJo's remarkable recovery, Rick replayed the rescue in his mind. Each moment was visibly etched in his memory: the fear, the adrenaline, the unwavering determination to save a life. It all seemed surreal now. His family was equally touched by the experience. Their children often shared their awe and pride in their father's actions with friends and teachers. "I never thought I'd see a chimpanzee hug my dad," his youngest son would say, recounting the story with the wonder it deserved. The event had become a defining moment for their family, a story that would be told and retold for years to come. The zoo also responded officially. They acknowledged Rick's bravery in a public statement. The director held a press conference to address the incident and highlight the positive outcome. "We are incredibly grateful to Rick Swope for his quick thinking and heroic actions," the director said, standing before a gathering of media personnel. "Without his intervention, JoJo might not be with us today. We plan to honor his bravery and commitment to animal welfare." The zoo announced they would be installing additional safety measures to prevent such incidents in the future. They also planned to name a part of the chimpanzee exhibit in Rick's honor, ensuring that his legacy would be a permanent part of the zoo's history. Rick was humbled by the attention and honors. To him, the recognition was secondary to the act of saving JoJo. He often downplayed his heroism and emphasized that he did what anyone else would have done in his place. But those who knew him and those who heard the story understood that his actions were far from ordinary. Rick's reflections also returned to that moment when JoJo had embraced him. It was a gesture that transcended species and spoke to the deep connections that can form in the most unlikely circumstances. As the weeks turned into months, life gradually returned to normal. Rick went back to his routine as a truck driver, but his life had changed. He started volunteering at the zoo. It wasn't only to spend time with JoJo, but also to share his experience and help educate visitors about the importance of animal welfare and safety. The zoo staff who had worked tirelessly alongside Rick also reflected on the event. The incident had been a wake-up call. Rick had taken control, but what if he hadn't been there? They were committed to making the necessary changes to make the zoo a safe place for both the animals in their care and visitors. The story of Rick Swope and JoJo the chimpanzee is extraordinary. His selfless act of bravery showcased a deep-seated instinct to protect and nurture life, regardless of the species. The embrace JoJo gave Rick in the aftermath of the rescue was more than just a gesture of gratitude. It was evidence of the unspoken understanding and connection that can exist across species barriers. Do you have a story about someone who risked their own life to save an animal? Tell us about it in the comments. We'd love to hear. For now, though, we're out of here. Catch you in the next video.